Welcome to the Global News Podcast on YouTube, where we go behind the headlines of a story and tell you why it really matters. I'm Ankur Desai, and today we're discussing whether economic ties between countries may be reset going forward. China and Canada have negotiated some historic tariff deals, and what implications could this have on Donald Trump and Washington? Because they started the ball rolling last year, imposing some big tariffs on a lot of their neighbours as well as rivals around the world. So to delve deeper into this, I've got Faisal Islam, our economics editor, who can tell us a little bit more. Faisal, this relationship between China and Canada, what does this mean for future negotiations between the two nations, but also the impact, the ripple effect it could have across the world?
Well, this is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? We haven't just got a sort of Western leader. It's a G7 leader, the seventh biggest democratic economies in the world. He's a member of the Five Eyes Western Intelligence Alliance. He's a serious guy, former Bank of England governor, Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, going to Beijing, the symbolism of meeting Xi Jinping within a year of him becoming Prime Minister, but also within a year of him having faced off or faced down what he calls his neighbour to the south, obviously Donald Trump, the USA, and their threats of trade war against Canada, threats that were delivered upon, threats that were sort of had the China fentanyl trade as a pretext, as the Canadians would see it. And yet now we see him in Beijing not just saying that there's a new world order, also saying there's a strategic alignment on various issues. And you have this sort of paradox, don't you, of Donald Trump trying to sort of throw his weight in his neck of the woods, a version of what was called in the 70s the Monroe Doctrine, now called the Dunroe Convention Doctrine, after Donald, that America would have supremacy in its own hemisphere. But the Canadians, often seen as a little sort of the little brother of the Americans, deciding to pop up in Beijing and do trade deals there in China, and not just do trade deals, also to abolish the taxes, the tariffs that are paid on China's booming electric vehicle industry, down to zero for tens of thousands of Chinese cars, which is obviously not the policy. You hardly see any of these cars in America. They're tariffed coming into Europe. They're not tariffed coming into the UK. But like just a fascinating sense of shifting sands in world power. And not that Donald Trump is watching those pictures, but if when he does see them, he may well contemplate that scene is a direct consequence of his actions.
I know, it feels like this could be a real seismic shift in trade relations between some countries, some bold words, as you mentioned, from Mark Carney there. I guess, could this be a question of now who deals with who going forward? And I guess, could it be the start of countries hedging against a more unpredictable United States, especially the way Donald Trump has been, I guess, trying to make different deals and be quite aggressive with the tariffs in particular?
Absolutely. Well, that scene, that picture that you see, the world seems to be defined by astonishing images right now. The image of Donald Trump with the five big tech bros from Silicon Valley at his inauguration. This is another stunning image of Mark Carney, a Western leader, going to Beijing at a time when the world's biggest Western power, America, wants to face off against Beijing and wants to create wants to create their own sort of band of brothers to take on China's technological, economic threat to their supremacy. No doubt about it. So to see the Canadians do this is fascinating. But the picture I recall from last year was when I went to Canada on the last day of Mark Carney trying to be elected Prime Minister. He was already appointed Prime Minister. He wanted to be elected Prime Minister. People were worried in Canada. They were worried. They were like, what is happening to America? And he said, well, we can deal with their threats. They are changing. Our relationship will change, but we have to diversify. We have to grow our trade with other countries. And what you get, and what is absolutely fascinating, I just dug up the numbers, is yes, the trade with America from Canada is down 5%, down 20 billion Canadian dollars in total from January to October last year. That is not great. But the trade with the rest of the world from Canada is up 22 billion Canadian dollars. So they've managed to diversify, and the symbol of that is what we see there with this visit to China.
Mark Carney, an interesting backstory as well in terms of his history when it comes to being a former governor of the Bank of England. He used economics as one of the key facets of his push to become the leader of Canada as well. And Also, Faisal, some of the quotes as well that I'm picking up from his conversations here with China. He's saying institutions like the World Trade Organization and International Monetary Fund would become less relevant, and there could be a change in how countries work together, and big institutions like the ones I've mentioned. They could be under threat as well. There've been some punchy words and a look into the future as to how economics could unfold between many countries, many nations around the world in terms of the relationships that could be forged going forward.
Now, yeah, part of this, Anil, is a reflection on not just America's policy, which they were the originators, the authors of a globalized world with these multinational institutions that help, if you like, lay out the rules of the road so that everybody had a fairish shot. That was the idea. They don't believe in those anymore. They're being ripped up. And it's some irony that you get the Canadians and the Chinese now defending that. In the communique from Carney and Xi Jinping, you have a whole paragraph saying we will now defend the multilateral institutions. That's clearly side-eye aimed at Donald Trump. It is quite incredible, really, to think of these things. And actually, the figures that I mentioned for Canada, they also apply to China. China has seen, I think, a 20% fall in the value of its dollar exports to the US. That is a disaster. That is a breaking of a traditional, if you like, the axis of the world economy. But they've seen huge increases in exports to Africa, 26% up, to Asia, the rest of Asia, to Europe, up 8%. So you're seeing this diversification. And if you're stood were in Washington D.C. with you can't say anything other than an increasingly isolationist America, which is rejecting, if you like, that it was the main beneficiary of this globalized world. It's big global brands, it's big banks, Silicon Valley. America won globalization. They're now rejecting it or rejecting its terms of trade. And when you look at the conception of Donald Trump's trade war, remember that big blue board that he held up in the White House? Um, that was it wasn't an attack, but it was a policy that affected the entire world and annoyed the entire world based on a fairly arbitrary calculation. And yet it caused so much bother for America itself, so much bother in the financial markets. Suddenly, the safest assets in the world, which is US government debt, there were doubts about that. That they had to row back, and suddenly it became, oh, this is mainly about China. All this stuff is so uncertain, and suddenly the tariffs went up to 100%, basically blocking off trade. Ships stopped sailing. And here's the point. If you were planning, as the Americans, if the actual plan was to take on the Chinese, you wouldn't have started by annoying not just the entire world, but also all of your principal allies. And that is
Yeah.
what happened. And that is very tricky.
Okay, so a couple of things to finish on then, Faisal. When it comes to this being a template for others to follow, could it be that? Also, how does this sit with Washington and Donald Trump? Loves to be the kingpin, loves to be the deal maker when it comes to things like tariffs and talking to other countries and being on the front foot. But also, this New World Order remark I thought was really interesting from Mark Carney. Would this rattle other leaders of other nations around the world? And how will those comments sit with some of those going forward?
So Carney has deep relationships. You mentioned his previous job as Bank of England governor, global financial diplomat. I remember talking to him in China when he was Bank of England governor after I think he met Xi Jinping at the 2008 G20 summit. He told me Xi Jinping put him on the top table, the top boat. There were two boats floating on the lake outside of Guangzhou, and he was on the top boat and the British Prime Minister was not. So he's always had some connections in this sphere. He works by economic logic and he works by growth, and he's like, well, okay, the Americans don't want our trade, we're just going to have to grow it elsewhere. And that's what he's trying to deliver. It is a logical push. It is not, though, doesn't sit particularly firmly with where the Americans, I think, want the world to go. But if they had wanted the world to go into some giant kind of battle between an America-led West and China, not just for economic supremacy, military supremacy, geopolitical supremacy, technological supremacy, there's astonishing things coming out of China right now that are competing with the best in Silicon Valley, whether it's electric vehicles, as we said, BYD, the Chinese exporter, now bigger than Tesla. Now, that's quite a statement. You've got chip manufacturing coming in there. You've got DeepSeek, we talk a lot about ChatGPT, but a tiny hedge fund in China developed a large language model that outcompeted the Americans. And what are the Chinese doing? They're focusing on cheap in terms of cost, cheap in terms of energy, AI, not trying to be the biggest, most powerful AI in the world, using up all the world's energy. And it reminds me of the space race, which obviously America ultimately won, but the Americans spent 30 million on a gravity-defying pen. The Soviet Union used a pencil, right? So you've got that type of vibe around. And so I think there is a model of diversity. It's not just a model, it's just a natural response. And I think in general, I'll put it like this. Understandably, all of us on podcasts like this, in our news organizations, in all the world's newspapers, on the internet, on X, everywhere, we are obsessed and focused with every tiny meander of Donald Trump's brain and what he says on X, what he says on Truth Social. What really matters in a global trade environment is how that is reacted to around the world and how the rest of the world interacts with each other. We're seeing the UK get closer to Europe after Brexit. We're seeing the UK doing deals with India. We're seeing India cozy up to Europe. There's a yin and yang to all of this. There is not just half the story, it is possibly the main story. Because although the US is the biggest, the first amongst equals, it is not the whole world economy. And I think we're seeing this so clearly in visions, in pictures like Mark Carney's visit to Beijing in the past few days.
Faisal, thank you so much for your time. Faisal Islam, our economics editor there. If you enjoy world stories like this one, do check out our Global News podcast. You can find that wherever you download your podcast from. Also, do subscribe and like to our BBC News YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your time. We'll speak to you again very soon.